So today's collaborate is about the digestive system. So good things and bad things about the digestive system. The good thing is we're familiar with it already. Everybody is kind of familiar with it. So you know a lot of the organs without having to study or anything, think about it. The bad thing is there's a lot of them. And so we have to deal with both of this, the good and the bad. So here's what the digestive system looks like. It's a tube. It's a tube and it's open on both ends. It's open at the mouth and it's open at the anus. And so food goes through here. It goes in one direction and then it goes all the way through. It keeps going. So it has both an entrance and an exit. It's a one-way tube. And if you look at this tube, you can divide it up in, or look at the digestive system, you can divide it into two parts. One part is the tube itself. So if it's part of the tube, that's called the GI tract, the gastrointestinal tract. And so if we look at that, that includes the mouth, the esophagus, the stomach, small intestine, large intestine, like that, all part of the tube. But there are also organs that are not part of the tube. They're sort of off to the side. So if they're not part of the tube, they're called accessory structures. So accessory structures, not part of the tube, they're still important though. But these are going to be things like the teeth. They're going to be things like salivary glands. They're going to be the liver, the gallbladder, things like that. So look, liver is here. It's not part of this tube. Here's the tube. There's the gallbladder. It's over here. It's not part of this tube. The pancreas, which is right here, not part of the tube. Those are all accessory structures. So we have the GI tract and we have these accessory structures. So here's a model that we have. And again, you can see the tube. Here's the tube right here. So all of that is the tube. So that's the GI tract. And then we also have these accessory structures. So here are the accessory structures over here and this right here. Those are accessory structures. Also teeth are accessory structures and things like that. So two different parts. So we're going to talk about all of these. But what I'd like to do is sort of just take a quick tour through this system and name all the organs and then we'll come back. So all this is a blow up of this part right here. And then we're going to go on down and blow it up as we go. So if we look at the first part, you're going to recognize a whole bunch of these things. There's the lips, and there's the teeth, and there's the tongue. Up here's the nasal cavity, which is not part of the digestive tract, but food can get in here if you vomit or something like that. But anyway, it's not considered part of the digestive tract. It's separated by bone and also by soft tissue. It's separated from the mouth, the oral cavity. So here's where the food goes, and then you swallow it, it goes into this, which is the pharynx. The word pharynx just means throat. And so it goes down through the throat. Air also goes this way, but right here, the path splits and food goes this way and air goes this way. So the larynx is not part of the digestive tract, but you can still see it here. Food is supposed to go this way. It goes into the esophagus. So those are the structures up here: oral cavity, pharynx, esophagus. If we follow the esophagus down, here's the esophagus. If we follow it down, we get to the stomach. And if we follow it from there, it goes into the small intestine. And so here, down here is the small intestine. We'll get to it in just a second. But right at the stomach and the beginning of the small intestine is the liver and the gallbladder, the pancreas. Now the spleen is there too, but it's not part of the digestive system. So we have esophagus, stomach, pancreas, gallbladder, liver, and then we move on down and we're going to see the small intestine. So there's our small intestine. The small intestine is called small because it's not very wide, but it is very long. And so if we follow it, it's going to go, starts right here, and it's going to go and it loops up and does all of this. Is very long. It's all folded up. And then the last part of it is right here. And then we have the large intestine. And so the large intestine goes like this, and it makes a loop, which you can't see, and goes this way. And so we also have the rectum. So if we look at this, there's the stomach, there's our pancreas, small intestine, large intestine, rectum, and right there's the anal canal and the anus. And that's that opening. So that's just kind of a tour through that whole digestive system. Any questions about any what these organs are called, anything like that? Okay, well, remember we have this tube. So here's a picture of the tube. There's a hollow space in the middle of the tube. That's called the lumen, and that's where the foodstuffs are. So that's where whatever you ate or drank or anything like that, the foodstuffs, that's where they're located. And if they stay in this hollow space, they're going to go all the way through and they're going to come out the other end. It's something we want to keep. We have to pull it out of the lumen and take it to blood vessels. And so we can carry it off to where we want it to go. Well, if you look at this GI tract, there are very specific layers to it. And there are 4 layers. So remember the hollow space is called the lumen. The layer that faces the lumen is called the mucosa. So it's a mucous membrane, a mucosa. And then there's a layer a little bit further out from that, which is made out of thick, dense connective tissue. That's the submucosa. And then if you come even further out, you wind up with smooth muscle. And the smooth muscle is going to help move things through this tube. That's called the muscularis externa. And then the last layer is this layer out here. It's a very, very thin layer. It's called the serosa. It's a serous membrane. And if you remember serous membranes, we talked about them back in A&P1. We talked about the pericardium, the pleura, and now this one is the peritoneum. So it's a serous membrane, and so it's called the serosa, wherever it is. Oh, there, serosa. So we have 4 layers, and you can see them here if I take a chunk out. So here is the mucosa, right there. There's the mucosa. Here's the submucosa right here. Here's this muscle, the muscularis externa, and there's that serous membrane, the serosa. Does it make sense? So 4 layers. Well, if we took this thing, that's just a chunk, and this is a chunk out of the small intestine. That's where this came from. We can see those layers. Well, if we were to take and make a model out of it, it would look something like this. So look, there's these 4 layers there. Again, 4 layers. So the hollow space is the lumen, and then we have the mucosa, submucosa, muscularis externa, and then serosa. But these layers also have sublayers. So if you look at The mucosa, look, it's got 3 sublayers. And if you look at the submucosa, it doesn't have any sublayers. If you look at muscularis externa, it's either 2 or 3, depending on where you are. And then the serosa also has 2 sublayers. So when we look at them, we can see them here as well. So there's our mucosa, and here's those sublayers. Submucosa doesn't have any sublayers. There's our muscularis externa. And right here, there's only 2 sublayers. Could also be 3, though, remember, depending on where you are. And then the serosa has these 2 sublayers. So if we look at it on a model, we can see that same thing. This is a little weird because of the conversion, but we'll try to deal with it. But look, here are our layers. Here is the mucosa right here. That's the mucosa. Here is the submucosa right here. And then the muscularis externa is right here. So that's our muscularis. And then that little thin layer, which is this serous membrane, this last layer right here. So if we look at them one by one, hopefully our conversion won't mess it up too much, but we'll look at them. So let's look at the mucosa first. So if you look at the mucosa, remember it has 3 sublayers. So there's an epithelium. Epithelium is going to be something like simple squamous or simple cuboidal or simple columnar, something like that. You should remember those from A&P 1. Lamina propria is this just loose connective tissue that holds this in place. And so it's very loose, thin. And then there's a tiny, tiny thin layer of smooth muscle. It's called the muscularis mucosae, and what it does is it changes or moves the mucosa around. So you get tiny little movements here of the mucosa. So we're going to see these 3 layers. So if we look at it, it's this right here. That's what we're looking at. And if we blow it up, it looks like this. So here is our epithelium. And in this case, it's simple columnar. These little blue things that you see are goblet cells. Hopefully you remember that from A&P 1, that with simple columnar, we often have goblets. And then here, this gray layer that you see, all of that is the lamina propria. And look what's running through the lamina propria. You can see blood vessels. So there's some blood vessels. You can see lymphatics. There's lymphatics. We just finished talking about them. And then there's this gray part, which is just this loose connective tissue. So that's lamina propria. And then there's this thin, thin layer of smooth muscle, and you can see it right here. And it's going to make this move or shift or change shape a little bit. That's the muscularis mucosae. So 3 sublayers: the epithelium, the lamina propria, and the muscularis mucosa. Make sense? If we look at the submucosa, there are no sublayers. It's basically the same all the way through. Same tissue. And so when we look at it, that's what it's going to look like. So again, this is messed up, but here's the submucosa right here. Well, look, there's a lot of stuff in there. There are glands in there. There are blood vessels in there. There are lymphatics in there. But the tissue is the same tissue all the way through. And the tissue is dense, irregular connective tissue. So if you remember that from A&P1, it's got a lot of collagen. And so this layer is tough and it's strong. If we blow it up, it looks, well, it looks bad. But anyway, there it is right there. So that is the submucosa. Let's look at the muscularis externa. So this is smooth muscle, and so this is what's going to push the foodstuffs along. Well, there are different layers of it, and the muscle cells, remember they look like this a little bit. They look like canoes or kayaks. They're oriented in different directions. And the direction that the cells are oriented tells us the name of the layer. So here, the cells are oriented up and down the tube. So they look like this, up and down the tube, long ways. And so this is called the longitudinal layer. And what's going to happen is if this muscle contracts, this is going to get shorter. So it's going to contract this way and get shorter. So it shortens the tube. But if you look at the circular layer, here's the direction these are oriented. They're oriented this way, around the tube. And so if this layer contracts, what's going to happen is the tube is going to do this. It's going to squeeze in where the contraction happens. And so it's going to get smaller in diameter. And then in the stomach, and only in the stomach, there's an oblique layer. An oblique layer, oblique means diagonal. So these fibers are running this way. They're running diagonally. And so when this contracts, you get shifting from one direction or the other. And so what this does is it allows food to be pushed along. So we can move it from one end of the tube to the other. There's a name for that. It's called peristalsis. So peristalsis is pushing the food around. So we can push it from the mouth through the esophagus down to the stomach and so on. But not only does it let you push food this way, it also lets you mix food. So we can mix it up while we're doing it. And so when you look at this one, it's this layer right here. Well, it's hard to see in this picture, but these fibers are running this way. So this is the longitudinal layer. And these fibers are running toward you. They're running up and down. They're running this way toward us. That's the circular layer. Well, this is not the stomach. And since it's not the stomach, there is no oblique layer. The only one that has the oblique layer is the stomach. Any questions? Again, here's these two layers. Here's the longitudinal layer. Here's the circular layer. And then we have the serosa. So the serosa is this outer part right here. well, not that, outer part right here is very thin. It's just this. But look, I can see sublayers in here. That's orange, and that's yellow, and that's gray. So I know that there's sublayers going on in there. There are two sublayers. You can't see this picture at all, but the yellow and the gray are the connective tissue. And then this pink layer, anyway, is the epithelium, and it's simple squamous epithelium. So if we go back to this picture here, here's the connective tissue, and here's the connective tissue. And then this little pink layer right there, that's the epithelium. I have to apologize for these. I don't know why they're so distorted. But anyway, hopefully you can figure it out. So if we look at an organ, look, this is the stomach. And we should be able to pick out these layers. Now this is the outside, so the outermost layer is the serosa. So that's what this is right here. Look how thin it is. That's the serosa. Look, you can even see through it. It's transparent. That's how thin it is. Remember, it's simple squamous epithelium. Simple squamous is a single layer of very flat, thin cells. Hopefully you remember that from A&P1. And then we have the muscularis externa. Well, look at the direction that the fibers are running. See these little streaky lines? They're running this way. But if I look here, look, they're running this way. And if I look here, they're running this way. So look, there are three layers. There's our longitudinal layer. It runs up and down. You can see it running like this. But this is running around. That's the circular layer. And this is running oblique. That's our diagonal or oblique layer. If we open it up, we should be able to see those other layers. So we can't see the serosa anymore, but this red is still this red. That's the muscularis externa. And then the white right here on the inside, which is that dense irregular connective tissue, that's the submucosa. So all of that white layer right there is the submucosa. And then this is the mucosa. So all of this layer here, this is that epithelial tissue and that lamina propria. That's the mucosa. Well, if you look at it in the stomach, look, it's all folded up like this, like an accordion. And these folds that you see are called rugae. We'll come back to that later on. But those are the layers. So serosa, muscularis externa, submucosa, mucosa. Any questions? Well, remember, this is not the stomach. This is the small intestine. So if we look at that, though, the only difference is there's not going to be three sublayers in the muscularis. But look, there's our mucosa. And even in this low picture, we should be able to pick out the sublayers. There's the epithelium, there's the lamina propria, and there's that little muscularis mucosa. And there's the submucosa. Remember, no sublayers, just one layer, but it's got a lot of stuff in it. It's got glands in it, it's got blood vessels and nerves. It's got lymphatics. That's a Peyer's patch, which we just finished talking about not long ago. And then here is our muscularis externa. Small intestine, so there's only 2 sublayers, but there's our longitudinal, there's the circular, and then here is that serosa with 3 sublayers. There's the epithelium, 2 sublayers. There's the connective tissue. And you can see all of that over here. Any questions? So, if I took all of the labels off of here, I just would hope that still you'd be able to talk about what all these things are. Now, we haven't covered everything, but we have covered these layers. So if I took them off, layers and sublayers, hopefully you'd be able to figure out what they were. Any questions? So this is in the abdomen here. Most of the digestive system organs are in the abdomen. And if you look in the abdomen, remember it's got linings in it. Those linings are serous membranes. And remember they're called peritoneum. So if we look at this, we can see this peritoneum. You can see it right here where these arrows are. See, that's the large intestine, but look at this layer right here. That's actually our serosa right there. And there's the serosa right there. And there you can see the muscularis externa, and you can see the submucosa, and you can see the mucosa. It's that way all the way through. Well, remember the peritoneum has 2 layers. It's a double layered membrane. Just like around the heart, just like around the lungs. And so there's a visceral layer, and the visceral layer is the one that touches the organ. So look, that's touching the organ. There's the organ right there. And that's touching it. It forms the outer layer of this particular organ. And so that is our serosa. So the serosa and the visceral peritoneum are the exact same thing. But remember, it's a double layer. So not only do we have a visceral layer, we also have a parietal layer. But the parietal layer doesn't touch the organ, it lines the cavity. Look, it's adhered to the wall of the cavity. Same thing over here, it's adhered to the wall of the cavity. That's the parietal peritoneum. And then, remember, there's a space between the 2 serous membranes. So if you're talking about the heart, there was a space between the 2 serous membranes. If you're talking about the lung, there's a space between the 2 serous membranes, and there's a space between these as well. So look, here's this one, and here's this one, and there's a space between it. So all of this space here is the peritoneal cavity. Here's another area where there's the peritoneal cavity right here. That space between here and here. And remember, the peritoneal cavity, just like the pericardial cavity and the pleural cavity, has fluid in it. It has serous fluid. And remember, serous fluid is very lubricating. It reduces friction. Well, in some places, the visceral peritoneum is 2 layers. So look, if this is an organ, there's my lumen right there, and I have the peritoneum around it. This is visceral peritoneum as it goes around. Visceral peritoneum, visceral peritoneum, visceral peritoneum. But when it gets here, this happens. And if I go away, this happens. So look, right there is a double layer of visceral peritoneum. If we go back one picture, we can see this exact same thing right there. Look, there's the organ, and here's peritoneum right here, and here's peritoneum. Well, right here, look, there's 2 layers of peritoneum. Double layer of visceral peritoneum. Well, if you do a sagittal section through the abdominal cavity, you can see this. So look, here's an organ. Here comes the visceral peritoneum right here. But it also goes around this side. So right here, it's a double layer of visceral peritoneum. Right here, it's a double layer of visceral peritoneum. Same thing here and here. Well, anytime that it's a double layer of visceral peritoneum, it's called mesentery. So mesentery is actually very, very important because what it does is it suspends the organs in the abdominal cavity. A good analogy for this would be a clothes hanger. Think about a clothes hanger that you have in your closet. It's what you hang your clothes on. You put a coat on it or whatever, and you put it in the closet, and it just hangs there. But what if you had no clothes hangers? What if you just went into your closet and you put all of your clothes in here without any hangers? What would happen is they just pile up on top of each other. And the bottom ones would get crushed or wrinkled by the top ones. And that's exactly what would happen here. If we didn't have mesenteries, all of these organs would fall to the floor of this abdominal cavity, and they would just pile up. And the bottom ones would be crushed by the top ones. So these mesenteries are really, really important. They suspend the organs. Look, that organ is just hanging in there by this. And that organ is hanging in there by this. And these are hanging by this. Not only does it suspend the organ in there, but this is how blood vessels get to the organ. So there are arteries that run right through here to get to that organ, run right through here to get to that organ. So these mesenteries are really, really, really important. Well, some mesenteries have names. So some of them have their own name. One of these is the greater omentum. One of them is the lesser omentum. The transverse mesocolon. Those are the only ones we're going to look at. The rest of them pretty much are just called mesentery. So if we look at the greater omentum, it's this one. It hangs down like this, almost like an apron. And it hangs down in front of the small intestines like an apron, just like this. It's attached to the stomach, and it's attached to the large intestine, but it hangs down like an apron. Another one that has its own name is this one. That's the lesser omentum. It connects the liver to the stomach. And then the other one that we're going to talk about is this one, which is called the transverse mesocolon. And the transverse mesocolon suspends and supports the large intestine. So these three are the ones that we're going to look at. So let's look at the greater omentum. So here's the greater omentum. And remember, it hangs down like an apron in front of the small intestines. It hangs off the bottom part of the stomach. And so if this is the stomach here, it hangs down like this, like an apron in front of the small intestines. And look, it's got blood vessels in it. You can see them there. That's what those red things are. And it's got nerves in it. It's also got fat in it. We store fat in it. That's what makes it yellow, is fat. So if you look at it, there it is again, the greater omentum. And again, you can see just how much fat is in it. And here is what it looks like again. And here's another picture of it. So this is for real. That's the greater omentum. And again, it hangs down off of the stomach like this, like an apron in front of the small intestines. And just like you can lift an apron if you want to and fold it back, you can lift this and fold it back too. So that's the greater omentum. We also have this lesser omentum. So the lesser omentum connects the stomach to the liver. So there's the stomach and there's the liver, and it connects those two right there. So if we look here, there it is right there, connects the stomach to the liver. There it is right there, the lesser omentum, the stomach to the liver. And then the last one that we're going to talk about is the transverse mesocolon. It's called transverse because it goes across your body like this way. Transverse. And it's called mesocolon because it holds the colon in place. So if you look at the colon, this part of it, it holds it in place and connects it to the rest of the colon, which looks like this. And so it's going to hold it in place like that. Well, you can't see it in this picture because it's hidden behind here. So we would have to remove that or flip it up in order to see it. So do remove it and flip it up. Now I don't know if I have a picture, but anyway, it's this right here. So I guess I don't have a picture. Let me look one more. Here's a picture. So look, there's the large intestine, and here's this transverse mesocolon. All of this right here, that's the transverse mesocolon. That's this right here. The rest of these are just called mesenteries. So mesenteries include these things right here. They don't have a specific name. They're just called mesentery. If you look at mesentery, this is mesentery right here. And look at this. You can see two layers. Two layers. Remember, it's a double layer of visceral peritoneum. So that is mesentery. And it's holding this in place, just like the hangers in your closet are supporting and holding up your clothes. And if you look at it for real, this is what it looks like. Look how thin it is. You can see through it. It's transparent because it's simple squamous epithelium is what it's made out of. Remember, simple squamous is very thin, but it's two layers because it's a double layer. And there's fluid between the two layers. That's that serous fluid. So all of this is mesentery. All of this is mesentery. Any questions? So that's the general stuff about the digestive system. So what we're going to do is we're going to start at the top and we're going to work our way all the way down. And so we're going to start with the mouth. And so we looked at it a little bit already. So let's blow it up and look at it. Again, there's some things you already know, which I shouldn't have to say. Things like lips and teeth. You already know those things. And the tongue, you already know that. Those things are very familiar to you. But remember, there's a nasal cavity up here, and the nasal cavity is separated from the mouth, from the oral cavity, by the palate. And the palate's divided up into two parts. The hard palate, it's hard because this is bone. You remember back in A&P1, the first 2/3 of this is the palatine process of the maxillary bone. And then the posterior 1/3 is the horizontal plate of the palatine bone. But it's bone, so it's hard. But if you go a little further back toward the back of the throat, it's not bone anymore. It's muscle and fat and epithelial tissue. That's the soft palate. And the soft palate is soft because when you swallow, this is what happens. It gets pushed like this, pushed, and what it does is it closes off the nasal cavity so that food can't go this way. It can only go this way. And then when you stop swallowing, this comes back down again so that you can breathe. But this soft palate, its job is to prevent food from getting up into the nasal cavity. Nasal cavity is very thin tissue. It's pseudostratified. And if you get food or liquid up here, it burns, it hurts because it's very thin tissue. If you look at the tip of the soft palate, there's a little hangy down little thing. But you can see if you open up your mouth and look in the back of your throat, that's called the uvula. The uvula does not have anything to do with voice or sound. It does not have anything to do with that. Again, it's to close this off while you're swallowing. From the mouth, we go into the pharynx. And the word pharynx means throat. So if you look at the pharynx, it's sort of a funnel-shaped tube like this, wide at the top, narrow down at the bottom. And when you get to the very bottom, two pathways are going to split off. And so one pathway is for air. It goes into your lungs. One pathway is for food. It goes into your stomach. And so when we look at this pharynx, it funnels the food and the air down here, but then it also has to prevent food from going down in here. When we look at it, it's a muscular tube, but it's divided up into three sections. There's the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. So let's look at them individually. Here they are. Here's the nasopharynx, oropharynx, laryngopharynx. Well, look at the nasopharynx. The nasopharynx is the same kind of tissue that you have here, which is pseudostratified columnar. Pseudostratified. This is also pseudostratified because the only thing that's supposed to go through here is air. So air is supposed to come in your nose and go this way. There should be no food going through here. And so this tissue is very thin and delicate. But if you look at the other two parts of it, look, food does go this way. And food is abrasive. Even some liquids can be abrasive. And so you can't have this thin, delicate tissue. So the tissues for these two is the same as it is in the mouth. It's simple squamous, stratified squamous, non-keratinized. So it's thick. It's got lots of layers. And so if you do rub some of them off, there's plenty more layers left there before you get down to blood vessels. So, nasopharynx, pseudostratified. Oropharynx, laryngopharynx, stratified squamous. There's also an opening right here, which is what food goes through to get to the pharynx. That is called the fauces, kind of like faucet, fauces. That's just this hole is all it is. It's not really a structure, it's a hole. The food then is supposed to go down to the esophagus. So if we look at the esophagus, here's the esophagus right here. It's a tube. But look where it is. If you look at the esophagus, it comes down from the throat like this. It passes through the diaphragm to get to the stomach. And so the esophagus is not in the abdomen, it's in the thorax. Well, that's going to make a difference because the thorax does not have peritoneum. So if we look at the layers of the esophagus, we're going to be missing a layer. We're going to be missing the serosa. So there is no serosa on the esophagus. So if we look at the layers, the outer one is missing. There isn't this outer layer, it's gone. Instead, what we have is dense connective tissue, not simple squamous, it's dense connective tissue, and it's called the adventitia. So if we go back and look at our GI tract again, we have a serosa everywhere except the esophagus. And in the esophagus, we have this adventitia. But the rest of the layers are the same. So look, there's our lumen, the hollow space. That's where the food is. There's the mucosa right there. Remember, stratified squamous. There's our submucosa. There's the muscularis externa, and we have two layers. You can see them. This is going this way, and this is coming out this way. So there's our circular layer, and this is the longitudinal layer. And then, instead of the serosa, we have this adventitia. So there is no serosa around the esophagus. But we still have 4 layers. And if we follow the esophagus down, remember it's going to pass through the diaphragm and we're going to get to the stomach. So there's the bottom end of the esophagus where it attaches to the stomach. So here's the esophagus right here. Well, if we look at that, at the very bottom of the esophagus is sort of like a valve. It's right here. Right here. And what it does is it closes the top part of the stomach. It closes it off so that food and acid and all that kind of stuff has a hard time going backwards because the stomach contracts constantly and mixes the food up. And so this sort of valve-like thing prevents the stuff from going back up that way. If it does get up here, if it does somehow get up in here, it burns like crazy. That's what heartburn is. So heartburn is when stomach contents and acid gets up in here and burns the esophagus. So that little valve-like structure is actually called a sphincter. So a sphincter is a circular muscle around the esophagus like this. And when it contracts, it closes the esophagus off. And so this sphincter is called the lower esophageal sphincter, or sometimes the gastroesophageal sphincter. Any questions about the esophagus? Okay, well, let's look at the stomach. So if we look at the stomach, we already looked at it a little bit. Remember, we named the layers. So here's the serosa, and there's the muscularis externa. We even named the individual layers here. Remember, there's a circular and a longitudinal and an oblique. And then if we open it up, we can see those stuff on the inside. We could go back here and name those here too. There's the submucosa, that white part, and there's the mucosa. We already know all that. So let's talk about the stomach in general. So if you look at it, it's sort of a J-shaped organ. It's kind of a J shape. And when you look at it, here is the esophagus right here. There's our sphincter right there. Well, look, there's an area of the stomach that juts up or domes up above the esophagus. That's called the fundus. There's this part right here, which is called the body. And then if you look at the bottom of it, it looks like a funnel. And the funnel is called the pyloric region. So if we look at it here, we can see that exact thing. Again, there's our esophagus, but there is going to be that hump, the fundus. There's the body. There's that funnel shape. We have one other region, and that's right here, right around where these two things meet, where the esophagus and the stomach meets, right where that sphincter is. And that's called the cardia, or cardiac region. So there are 4 regions. So we have the fundus, the body, the pyloric region, and right here is that cardiac region, or cardia. If you look at it, look, there are 2 sort of curves with the stomach. So there's an inside curve, which is smaller. And so it's called the lesser curvature. There's an outside curve, which is bigger, and it's called the greater curvature. And right here at these curvatures are where those mesenteries are attached. So remember, we named some mesenteries. There was one mesentery that ran from here up to the liver. So that's where the lesser omentum is. So the lesser omentum is at the lesser curvature. And then there's this one which hangs down, remember, like an apron in front of the small intestine. And so that's the greater omentum. So the greater omentum is on the greater curvature, which makes it a little bit convenient. We also already know the names of these layers. So if we look at the fibers here, look, we can see these fibers are running this way, running around the stomach. But if we look at these fibers, look, they're running this way. They're running the length of the stomach, long ways. And if we look at these, look, they're running this way, diagonally. So if you name those, here is the circular layer. Here is the longitudinal layer. And here is the oblique layer. And remember, the stomach is the only place where there are 3 layers. Everywhere else, there's only 2. Sublayers of this muscularis externa. Remember, everywhere else there's only 2. There's the circular and longitudinal, but the stomach has 3. If we open up the stomach, we already know the layers here. There's our submucosa. There's our mucosa. You can also see the muscularis externa, which we saw from the other side. But look, this mucosa is all folded up. These folds are called rugae. We also already talked about the sphincter right here. There's the sphincter right there. That's this sphincter. But there's another sphincter at the other end of the stomach. So this sphincter is between the stomach and the small intestine. It's called the pyloric sphincter. So we have 2 sphincters. We have the gastroesophageal sphincter, and we have the pyloric sphincter. If you look at the mucosa, it's this part right here, remember? And there's our 3 layers of muscle. There's our serosa. There's our submucosa. We know those layers, but if we look at the mucosa, look at it. It has a lot of glands associated with it. And these glands make 2 different things. They make acid. It's hydrochloric acid. And they also make enzymes, which are going to digest proteins. And then they actually make a 3rd thing, which is mucus. So there's the gland. And look, it looks like a little pit here before we get to the gland. And that's exactly what they're called. So if we look at one of these glands, there it is right there. Now remember, there are thousands of them, but this model only shows 1. But right there is the pit where we're going to come in, and then we have the gland. If we blow that up, it looks like this. So this part's the pit. These are called gastric pits. And then we get down to the gland down here. Well, there are 3 different kinds of cells in here, and each one makes something different. These little blue ones that look like this, they're actually the large cells here. They're called parietal cells, and those are the ones that make hydrochloric acid. The stomach is very, very, very acidic. It has a pH of around 2. So it's a very strong acid. We also have these cells here, which are called chief cells. So that's all of these. These are chief cells. And chief cells make an enzyme. The enzyme is called pepsinogen in its inactive form. And so it doesn't do anything until the acid cuts a little piece off and it becomes pepsin. And then pepsin digests proteins. So it chops proteins up into smaller segments, into peptides. And then there are these cells which make this mucus. And the mucus is there to protect the stomach wall from these acids and from this pepsin. So 3 different kinds of cells. And there they are right there. If we blow that up, looks like this. There's our parietal cells. Again, those are the ones that make the acid. And here's the acid they make. There's our chief cells. Those are the ones that make the enzyme, that's pepsinogen, and then the acid cleaves it or cuts a piece off and it becomes pepsin. And pepsin, again, digests proteins. But we have to have protection because this acid would destroy the tissues. These pepsin would destroy the tissues. And so we also have these mucus cells, which are also very, very important because they protect the wall of the stomach from the acid and the enzymes. So if we look at it on the model, it looks like this. Well, what they did was they colored each cell a different color. So right there is the opening to the pit. So there's our pit right there. And then here's the gland right here. And the gland has these mucus cells, which are pink, these chief cells, which are blue, and these parietal cells, which are yellow. And it looks something like that. Any questions? So that's the stomach. And that's as far as I want to go today. So tomorrow we'll pick up with the small intestine and we'll finish it up. Any questions? Did we get lecture note word file 2 on digestion? We're not covering digestion lecture. It's only in lab. So there should not be a section for digestion lecture-wise. Yeah, the digestive is just in the lab exam, not in the lecture exam. So basically it'll just be like naming structures. Mostly that's what it is. Any other questions?